Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. As we discuss the various issues on this episode, the G7 summit is taking place where the group of seven countries are meeting, and India is also attending. Prime Minister Modi is in Germany because he's been invited along with few other countries like Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal, South Africa. They've been invited as partner countries. We will look at the significance of this invitation. Prime Minister Modi is there on the invitation of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So the G7 meeting is taking place, and the focus is to step up further sanctions so that the war against Ukraine can be brought to a quick end. But the question is, will that take place? Uh, four of the member countries have already announced that they're going to ban the export of gold from Russia. These countries are UK, US, Japan, and Canada. How effective will that ban be? Will that really force Russia to end this war? Because Russia is also facing a very difficult economic situation now, and it is probably the first time in a century that Russia has defaulted on foreign currency debt. So we will look at some of those very important questions on this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma, and joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Warm welcome to you, Harsh.
Hi,
Let's start by looking at the G7 summit. Prime Minister Modi is there. Let me begin by asking you, what's the significance of India being invited there as a partner country? There are a few other countries that have been invited. The Prime Minister Modi has also interacted with the Indian diaspora there. These countries are meeting in Germany. Now, let's look at how significant is this.
Well, I think there are two aspects. One is the importance of G7 itself and how this is a critical moment for G7, given the challenges that they are facing on several fronts. And this is a grouping of the most advanced, industrially advanced countries in the world. And yet, if you see these countries struggling to cope with global problems, there is a crisis in Ukraine, of course, that has taken a very different dimension, militaristic dimension. There is a global economic crisis brewing. There's a climate crisis that is brewing. There is, of course, COVID is still not over. So multiple challenges from multiple quarters, and the world's foremost economies are struggling to come to terms with these challenges. So I think for G7 now, what is important is to project a sense of unity, a sense of purpose, and to ensure that that the challenges that the global community is facing, these advanced economies have some answers to those questions. So then that is one aspect of why this meeting is important, and in particular in the context of Ukraine, this is important because Russia is watching closely at any signs of disunity, and therefore you see Mr. Biden reiterating it time and time again
Yeah.
that we have to be together. We have to, we have to continue to support Ukraine. There is the unity among the Western countries should not be seen to be dissolving at this critical juncture when we are looking at Russian control over eastern Ukraine getting strengthened. Russia, in fact, has been targeting now Kiev, just as G7 meeting has been happening in Germany. So I think that for a lot of these G7 member countries, Ukraine question is almost an existential question about the unity of purpose behind these advanced economies. Now, India's engagement there is interesting and important because for the last few G7 meetings, India has been almost a permanent invitee now. And I think this is a recognition of the fact that when you look at global problems today, you really cannot provide solutions to those problems without India being on board. And I think, therefore, this engagement with India continues to get strengthened despite some visible differences on Ukraine. So if you keep Ukraine aside, you would see that India continues to be quoted. India continues to be an important partner for these countries, and then certainly these countries feel that India should be on board if some of these challenges are to be met. But in particular, I think what is interesting is that at a time when the Chinese model is being projected by China as the better one compared to the Western democratic model, I think India is a country that presents a contrast to that Chinese model. Here is a democracy with all its challenges, that has managed its problems, that has managed to provide economic growth and poverty alleviation to its people, and that is also providing solutions to global problems. So I think India's ability to emerge as a provider of global solutions is also part of this enticement that India presents today. So I think, by and large, if you see how G7 and India are interacting today, it's a very interesting interaction, because India certainly is not a part of G7, but
Mhm.
India is being seen as an integral to the management of global problems, something that the G7 countries, when they had created this platform, envisioned that they would be the ones who would be providing solutions. So I think we have moved to a point where without India, a lot of these problems would not be resolved, and therefore having India within the tent is something that is now looked favorably upon. So, by and large, an important summit in the context of Ukraine, but also in the context of what it says about India's rising global profile.
Absolutely, and in the context of the global challenges right now, of how to control inflation and the energy crisis, the focus is on all those problems. All these group of seven industrialized nations are meeting there along with these partner countries, but they've also announced tougher sanctions against Russia. Harsh, UK, US, Japan, and Canada have already announced that they're going to ban the Russian gold imports. Now, will it cut off the funding for Putin's war machine, like as they call it, or do you think it is kind of it'll be effective in isolating Russia from the international financial system? Will that be effective? Because as these nations are meeting at this platform, Putin has again stepped up the attack. And in about 3 weeks, for the first time, there was a Russian missile that landed in Kyiv. And he is signaling that we are not backing out.
Putin is not. I mean, it seems to me that Mr. Putin can't really afford to, back off from a war that he has started, and he will need to show some concrete gains to his people in order to move back, or in order to take a step back. So I don't think that that is in the offing. And if you see the statements on both sides, both Russians and the Ukrainians, as well as the Western countries that are supporting Ukraine, they seem to be gearing up for a long war of attrition. So there is no hint that either of the two sides is willing to now engage in a political process leading to some kind of a resolution, or a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. I think still the instrumentality of force is seen as the most important, as the most viable means of for either side to reach some kind of a conclusion. But I think what the G7, and as you mentioned, it's of the four countries of the seven members, what they've tried to now showcase is that despite the longevity, or the seeming longevity of this war, they remain united in their approach towards Russia. They do not want to cut any slack. They want to ensure that the message that is getting out from the G7, from the developed world, from the industrially advanced world, is that they have no intention of loosening the sanctions regime vis-a-vis Mr. Putin and Russia.
So,
But
in
of
fact, they're
course,
trying to
yeah,
show, yeah, in fact, they're trying to show that there are options of tougher sanctions. So they
yes. So
can
there's
further scale up the sanctions. Mm.
indeed they want to climb that escalation ladder, and there is an escalation is still possible within the sanctions framework. So I think that is the message that they want to send. The question is whether the sanctions regime is going to be effective enough in raising the cost so high for Mr. Putin that he will decide to come to the negotiating table. So far, it doesn't seem it is working, because we know that the sanctions that have been imposed are one of its kind. These are one of the strongest sanctions regime we have seen against any country, against any regime. And yet Mr. Putin has been nonchalant about it. He continues to wage his war against Ukraine. He continues to ratchet up tensions. He continues to engage Ukraine militarily. And in fact, we have not seen any sign that, despite some stress on the Russian economy, that Russians are feeling the pinch as of now. So for
But
Mr.
are the
Putin,
Russians now feeling the pinch? Because, I mean, for the first time, they have defaulted on a foreign debt. And can Putin still reduce the impact of this ban by turning to the emerging markets?
I think there are two issues. One, he has. I mean, Russia has defaulted certainly, and I think this is for the first time since 1918. If the details that I have are right, but I think. Uh, that default is primarily, that the Russians are saying that they are willing to pay, that they have no intention of defaulting, but it's the international financial architecture that has boycotted, Putin's Russia, that is preventing Russia from making those payments with the usual systems and mechanisms
Yeah.
available. So I think it's a more of a technical question rather than a question of Russia not having the resources to pay back the debt. So I think
Mhm.
even now, given the energy dependence of Europe on Russia, Russians seem to be having enough reserves with them. So it doesn't seem at the moment, until now, that the sanctions have bitten to an extent that the Western world would have thought. Also, apart from the Europeans, we have seen the numbers. For example, China has bought a lot of Russian oil, discounted oil. Russians have offered it to India. Russians have offered it to some other countries. There is a lot of receptivity in Africa. So I think there is a larger picture here, which makes Russia seemingly not as isolated as perhaps the Western world would have wanted. And this has implications for Russia's own future, Russia's own strategic posturing vis-a-vis Ukraine and the West. But of course, the issue is, can Russia sustain it? And I think there are reports that are coming from the ground are that the kind of losses that Russians have seen on the battlefield, the kind of both manpower losses as well as equipment losses mean that if the present trends continue, it would become unsustainable very soon. But so far, that point has not been reached, and therefore, what G7 perhaps want to ensure, G7 members want to ensure, is that, look, while the sanctions regime may not be biting enough for the moment, but we have enough in our kitty to raise this bar even further. And I think that message seems to be the one that they want to convey through G7. And Russia, of course, is through its actions is insisting that it couldn't care less, at least as of now. So I think we are in for a stalemate for a while.
Absolutely. While at least the message that's coming out is that Russia is turning into a political, economic, and financial outcast. But Russia is, like you said, the stalemate is probably going to continue for a while. But also, if we look at publications other than the West, there seems to be a narrative that this could be probably Biden's last attempt to rally the allies here in the West before he faces the midterm poll in November, where there are predictions that the Democrats are probably not going to do that well. Do you see this as Biden's last attempt to kind of rally the allies? What's happening at G7 now?
It is certainly, I think, one platform that is available to him as of now before midterms to make his case of continuing unity, of the need for continuing unity among the G7 members and among the Western countries vis-a-vis Russia. Now, I think a lot would, of course, we know that as of now, the trends indicate that the Democrats may not do very well. Mr. Biden's own popularity is nosediving in the U.S. U.S. is
Inflation
getting
is very high also.
inflation is very high. Energy costs, food costs are rising. We have Roe versus Wade. The decision has polarized once again. The polarization is out on the streets in America. So I think the domestic capacity of the U.S. to withstand the challenges that American allies are facing around the world today is certainly at stake. And for Mr. Biden, for President Biden, this is certainly a moment to reiterate American commitment to some of these larger global issues. Now, whether he can sustain that post November elections, midterm elections, that remains to be seen. But as of now, certainly it provides him a platform to make his case for a continuing need for unity, for the need that that Russia has to be isolated, and that Western countries should continue to ratchet up the pressure rather than giving in to this idea that, look, Ukraine eventually will have to come to the negotiating table with the Russians. So I think we have seen the signs that we are now looking at and President Zelensky is also asking for more weapon systems from the West, and West is increasing the support, at least as of now. So the idea is that if this is a war of attrition, then let us continue to support Zelensky and Ukrainians with the weapon system that would allow them to maintain a modicum of stalemate on the ground vis-a-vis Russians, and that would not allow Russia to win a dramatic victory over the Ukrainians. And I think that's a message that perhaps he will be sending to his G7 counterparts. But also interesting to mention that India will be there. That the three other countries that you had mentioned have also been invited along with India, and the idea is also to send out this message that look, this is also about democracies, that this is also about a different kind of political systems around the world. But whether India and other countries do see the Ukraine conflict from a democracy versus autocracy prism, that also is questionable. I think India has never taken that stand so far. So I think for Mr. Biden, this is an important moment to continue to press for unity, to continue to press for convergence among like-minded countries on this issue. How far he succeeds, that would of course depend on not only on this summit but also on what happens in American domestic politics in November.
Yes, Harshan, India's position is unique as far as Ukraine is concerned, because it's not really with the West as far as it stand on Ukraine and Russia is concerned, nor is it with with China. Uh, why I'm asking you this is because just before this G7 meeting, the BRICS summit took place, and it took place in the background of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the continuing border tension between India and China. And we saw that Prime Minister Modi actually skipped Ukraine, and he spoke more on the pandemic, while the focus at the BRICS summit also was on Ukraine. While Xi Jinping tried to portray that there's a lot of cohesion amongst the BRICS members, what important messages did really come out of BRICS?
Well, I think BRICS was an interesting case study in in how institutions or platforms where you have countries with divergent strategic interests muddle along.
Yes.
And I think BRICS is one such platform where the fundamental fault line at the moment is between India and China. And India certainly is there because it views that platform as a means of reaching out to Russians and to the Chinese, despite the bilateral problems. But I think if you, as you were mentioning, if you look at the focus areas, India was also very categorical in not making a BRICS platform a means that could project that look, India is with China and Russia on the Ukraine question, because India's position is distinct. India's position is that UN Charter, the international law, territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations should be considered sacrosanct. Now, of course, there are two countries now in BRICS that are challenging territorial integrity and sovereignty of other countries, China and Russia. And India has made this point in other avatars earlier. Now, so therefore, for Prime Minister Modi, uh, his focus on pandemic, his focus on governance, health governance, meant that he could steer the conversation in areas where India feels BRICS members have much to learn from each other and engage with each other on. But by skirting the issue of Ukraine, he was also signaling that India stands apart, not in any camp, not in the Western camp, and not in the Russia-China camp, if you will. But India's approach is distinct. India's interests are distinct, and the larger issue of China-India problems, China-India border tensions, are likely to shape the future evolution of BRICS as well. Because unless China is able to manage India better, the future of BRICS will remain contentious. The future of BRICS will remain suboptimal, and I think that's why you see the focus areas becoming different. India becoming narrower in its approach to the issues on BRICS, whereas China and also Russia trying to expand the remit or trying to expand the ambit of the discussions that could happen within the BRICS platform. And I think that divergence speaks for itself as to the priorities of these countries.
Sure. Harsh, there are a couple of questions that I would like to include which have been sent by our viewers. There's a question about Taiwan and how will India react to Taiwan's independence as China is threatening Taiwan over independence, and also China claims the territory. Uh, will Quad intervene in the issue of invasion of Taiwan, or US will take steps in this region? But along with that question, I also would like you to comment on the recent ASEAN summit that India hosted, and the focus during this ASEAN summit and the role of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific and the centrality of ASEAN.
Yeah, so in some ways, for India's Indo-Pacific policy to be successful, it is very important that India's ASEAN outreach becomes more substantive. So therefore, the India ASEAN summit was extremely important because it conveys to the world that India remains committed to ASEAN, that ASEAN centrality is important, is an important variable for India when it looks at its larger, wider Indo-Pacific policy. And what I think India has been able to do over the last few years is make itself a more integral part of the Southeast Asian landscape. Rather than a country that had to be invited, India is now arguing that look, India is an organic part of Southeast Asia with its links to with its cultural ties and economic and trade ties with countries in its periphery like Myanmar and Thailand and Indonesia, etc. But what is also interesting is India's growing footprint in the defense sector. If Defense Minister Rajnath Singh's visit this month uh, to Vietnam, signing of the India Vietnam Defense Framework Agreement, underlying the need for India to engage more substantively with Vietnam, and for Vietnam to look at India as a reliable defense partner. These are important changes in India's posture in the region to emerge as a credible security provider, as an both economic security provider as well as diplomatic security provider. So I think there is a larger sense that India should continue to see ASEAN as central to its Indo-Pacific outreach. On the question of Taiwan, which I think was mentioned,
Yes.
it is very interesting that if you see the conversations that happened at Shangri-La Dialogue this month, earlier this month, uh, Taiwan was at the heart of the conversation. Taiwan has suddenly become, the next big flashpoint on the global scene because there is a lot of concern that what Russia is doing to Ukraine, China may be tempted to do vis-a-vis Taiwan. Of course, Ukraine and Taiwan are not comparable in many ways, but I think the sense that you have China becoming more powerful, China becoming more aggressive, and China challenging the fundamental norms that have shaped the interstate behavior in the Indo-Pacific for last several decades have brought us to this point. And U.S. Secretary of Defense was very categorical in his speech at Shangri-La that look, China is challenging and China is aggressive. China has to be pushed back. And similarly, on the other hand, when it was the Chinese defense minister's turn to take the podium, he was equally he pushed back equally strongly, and he was very categorical that China will fight if need be to protect its interests in Taiwan. So I think there is a sense that Taiwan can become the next flashpoint if it is not already, and Taiwanese are aware of it. You see every few weeks Chinese fighter jets intruding into Taiwan's ADIZ, and America then trying to create a show of strength there in its own way. But Taiwanese are aware of the challenge that they are facing. The Indo Pacific is aware of the challenge that Taiwan issue is posing now to the wider Indo Pacific security. And I think the two major powers in the world today, China and the US, are increasingly are increasingly at odds on this fundamental question that for a while it seemed had been resolved in some ways, but now all the terms of that engagement are being reset. How they are reset, what are the implications of that reset? I think that will define perhaps the future of Taiwan and the future in many ways of the Indo-Pacific stability and security. And Quad, therefore, which talks of stability and security in the Indo-Pacific as a fundamental norm that needs to be protected, we'll have to find a way to address this problem.
Sure. Thank you so much, Harsh, for that explanation and that analysis. We have time for just this much on this episode of the Ideas Factory, but we would request our viewers to send in your questions and we will try and take as many as possible in the next episode. Thank you for watching.